Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another Journey Planner. This evening we have Philip Dumas joining us from Stevenage Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I think we're going to have a very interesting program with Philip. The presentation is Starting a Garden, and we're going to hear a bit about how Philip ended up in Stevenage and more about starting a garden. All right, so you should see the Journey Planner on our YouTube page. You can also find us at our YouTube handle, which is at the Journey Planner SDA7, and there you'll be able to find all our recordings. Then if you head across to our website, you can find us at thejourneyplan.co.uk, and there you'll find more information about who we are, the team behind the scenes, past presentations, and various resources. So I also like to point out that our presenter has a YouTube presence called WeSo, where they have various gardening, the journey of their whole exploits on the gardening scene, I believe. I've watched a couple of videos and they're very informative, and I'd encourage everyone to join. You can see the YouTube handle is at WeSo9065. So check that out later on as well. So for now, I'm going to hand over the time to Philip and kick into the presentation that will inform us on how to start a garden. So over to you, Philip.
Good evening. Thanks for the introduction, Trevor. So my name is Philip Dumas, and I attend Stevenage SDA Church, as Trevor mentioned. And I've been in Stevenage for the past 8 years or so. Now I'm going to be sharing about starting a garden myself, as well as what we've entitled our project. So the project that we have, my wife and I, is called WeSo, and we have an acronym which I'm going to explain in the presentation. So for now, I think it would be fitting for us to just start with a word of prayer. Okay. Let's bow our heads. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this wonderful evening. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to be able to come on this platform and to be able to share. I pray that you may give me the ability to share these things in the manner that you intend. And I pray that you may also just allow your spirit to lead, um, not only as far as my words are concerned, but also the hearts of all those who are going to be in attendance, whether they be they watch respectfully. Thank you, and we understand things in Jesus' name. Okay, so as mentioned, my name is Philip, and WeSo is the name of the family project that my wife and I started. So it's kind of the face of all of our endeavors. And we have this acronym, which is Food, Thoughts, and Faith. And as you can see on the slide, we have the various social media platforms that we are on. So our story. So originally, I'm from London, and I grew up in East London in Walthamstow. And my wife, on the other hand, her name's Dion, and she grew up in Birmingham. Now, for our experience, Dion, she was somebody who has of seeing her grandfather garden as an allotment, and she used to help him from time to time when she was a child. Um, the experience for me was a little bit different, however. So my father, he was always the one who was into gardening. He didn't have an allotment per se, but we had a 100-foot garden where we were living in London. So we had plenty of space for him to grow vegetables. So I grew up seeing him growing various things that we could eat as a family. And I'd say from a very early stage at that point, it piqued my interest, even though I didn't always get involved as much as I probably would have liked to. Pardon me. Sorry, just trying to. I think I'm having trouble with controlling the slides. I'm not sure what's actually happening. Um, so bear with me a second, please. Okay.
Yeah, no problem.
So just to continue, sorry about that slight interruption. So for us, as far as our journey together in gardening, so we got married in 2015. 2015 was quite an important year for us, because it was obviously the time when we got married, but for myself as well, that was a year in which I got the experience of being introduced to gardening by attending a gardening school. And the gardening school that I went to was held on the Advent Farms, and that was in Northamptonshire. And so coming out of that experience, I was eager to make a start. Now, when we got married, we moved to Stevenage, and we moved to Stevenage because we wanted somewhere that was a give I was from and I was from London. Property that we were renting was a small house. It had a concrete garden, and so we started out just by using pots to do our gardening. And so this picture just kind of shows some of the things we started out with. And as you can see, there's some spinach, which you can see anybody who knows gardening knows that these are starting to bolt. But we started on very humble beginnings. Now, moving forward, a member at Stevenage Adventist Church was quite kind enough to let us use a piece of their allotment patch. So we decided to get started just using a very small piece of an allotment to grow some bits and pieces. Now, as we were there, we decided that we might as well just get started on the process of trying to get our own allotment plot. So we put our names on the list, and God blessed us and to be able to get um, to the waiting list, but actually get to have a plot to choose months after we had just begun starting in this members patch. So this was the patch that we got. Um, it'd be classed as a full plot allotment that we had. Unfortunately, the allot unfortunately the allotment plot had a greenhouse as well as a shed on it. Um, so it meant that as far as equipment was concerned, we could store a lot of things on site. And also we had the opportunity to start off plants in the greenhouse as well. So it was a really good plot that we had, but it needed a lot of work. As you can see, it hadn't been used in a couple of years. Now, the pictures left and right, what you can see here are a comparison of the before and after. So left was the season, and as the season had progressed, we had cleaned up the majority of it. And as you can see here, these are just some examples of some of the things we were growing. You can see my wife on the right-hand side as well, just helping with the planting of the pumpkins. So that just kind of gives a bit of an insight that what we started off with was allotment gardening. And the reason why we thought it was a good place to start was because I honestly believe that you have to kind of start gradually and you have to be willing to progress rather than always thinking that you can jump into the deep end. And I think what it showed, as far as our journey is concerned, was that you can start off not having a lot of space like we did in our little one-bed house, and then progress to having a little bit more. And I honestly believe that the majority of people who are probably going to be watching this, whatever stage you are at, you have a lot of space or you are aspiring for something, I believe that an allotment sized amount of land is probably, pardon me, what most people would be able to manage and what most people would find themselves being able to work, even if they did get a piece of land that was more, because it's actually quite a lot of work just trying to tend to a garden. So I'm just going to get into the presentation now. So the presentation is how to start a home garden. And I'm just going to be highlighting some useful principles. And the principles cover spiritual principles, as well as some practical things to consider. So let's continue. So first and foremost, there are several benefits to growing food. There are the laws of nature and also health are things which one gets to experience when you grow your own. You get the opportunity to eat more fruit and vegetables. You get to save money to some extent. You also get the benefit of exercise. You get the benefit of mental health benefits from gardening. And also the garden allows opportunities for learning object lessons, especially spiritual object lessons, which I think are quite important because when you look at the context of how the Bible was written, the Bible spoke to a lot of things that people saw and experienced in the economies that they existed in. And given the agricultural nature of the time of Christ, it was quite fitting that Christ used nature to illustrate many things. And unfortunately, what I find is that because we live very detached from that kind of lifestyle, where we are very much detached from the production of food and things of that nature, it has an impact of causing some of the lessons and the nuances that are found in these illustrations that Christ uses to go over our heads. But suddenly things make a lot more sense when you actually start the process of gardening. Another benefit is for child development. So Ellen White, in her writings, in the Spirit of Prophecy, she states that a part of true education must include or should include the garden. True education in that sense, because if we think about man's first occupation, man was placed in a garden, and it was a place whereby the object lessons of God and his character were taught very clearly. And so when molding the mind of children, Ellen White strongly advocates for the garden being a key place for teaching to take place. Now I'll just proceed further. There's some important counsel to consider. So this is from the Spirit of Prophecy. This is from the book Country Living. and it highlights some important attitudes that we should have when we are approaching gardening. So it states that the land is to supply our necessities, and that if the land is cultivated, it will, with the blessing of God, supply the necessities. We are not to be discouraged about temporal things because of apparent failures, nor be disheartened by delay. Now, that's an important lesson that a believer has to take into their spiritual experience, because in the reality of the last day context, there are many things which God's people are to face, as far as disappointment, delay, even in the past, when you look at the early Advent movement, and even just in the Bible, many of the people who went before us experienced failures, delays, things to be about. So whilst we're in a time of what could be seen as relative peace and safety, um, it's in this time that we are supposed to develop or have experiences that prepare our characters for the real tests, which touch on these various things. Now, she goes on to say we should work the soil cheerfully, hopefully, gratefully, believing that the earth holds in her bosom rich stores for the faithful worker to garner, stores richer than gold or silver, and that the niggardliness laid to her charge is a false witness. And niggardliness just means laziness. So the garden is supposed to also give us an opportunity, like Christ, to practice the characteristic of how we are to attend to all of our work, to do so with the right spirit, because it's not about what, but it's the spirit that we do that reflects whether we are practicing the character of Christ. Go further. Now, she goes on to say, with proper intelligent cultivation, the earth will yield its treasures for the benefit of man. The mountains and hills are changing. The earth is waxing old like a garment, but the blessing of God, which spreads a table for his people in the wilderness, will never cease. So we see here that we just have some promises that's highlighted, that even in the midst of difficulties, that God allows the earth to yield its treasures for man. And so therefore, the garden is an object lesson for us to recognize that God's promises will never fail. As we go through the process of growing things and seeing his hand, then we are getting practical training or practical example of things that God has to say concerning his promises. So these are just opportunities of that reminder constantly over and over again. Now, there are some promises relating to agriculture. I'm not going to go through all of these, but they are here. So if there's anybody who is seeking to take a screenshot of these, they can feel free to do so. But they just highlight some of the things that God has said concerning agriculture that we can take as promises. And these were just a nice selection that I had collated. Now, there's some more counsel. This is from the book of Revelation 13 and verse 17. Now, this is interesting because it highlights one of the importance of the garden, particularly in an end time context. And it says, and no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Now, the key thing which is highlighted here is that the issue of buying and selling in the last days is a very serious one. And it is the thing or the vehicle which Satan intends to use in order to bring God's people to a place of compromise. Because if you think about buying and selling, we buy and sell to secure our essential needs. And what more essential need is there than food? We think about, for example, Esau giving up his birthrights due to the hunger that he experienced. And the reality is that God's people in the last days, nothing has changed. And so Satan knows that he can utilize these things. And so this is why we need to heed God's instruction. Now, Ellen White states in the Spirit of Prophecy, in the book Adventist Home, the importance of the garden, she says that it contributes to economic security. And she says, again and again, the Lord has instructed that our people are to take their families away from the cities into the country where they can raise their own provisions. For in the future, the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one. Now, I don't want to give a misconception of suggesting that we do the gardening because it's going to protect us during the great time of crisis and that we're going to be storing up all of this food and things of that nature. That's not really what I believe this quotation is getting at. It's more so the issue that the end time scenario that we should be aware of is happening right now. Right now, we are in a stage whereby God has instructed his people to relocate out of the large cities, and that there are benefits as buying and selling gets worse and worse as we go into the little time of trouble in having the ability to produce our own provisions, so that prior to the great crisis where we have to flee, during that little time where you have these smaller shocks that test God's people as things get worse, during that period of time, that God's people would have a benefit of having the ability to produce their own produce rather than being 100% dependent on the system. Another council, going back to the education for children that I've mentioned in my list of benefits of the garden, and it states, so far as possible, let the child from his earliest years be placed where this wonderful lesson book shall be opened before him. Let him behold the glorious scenes painted by the great master artist upon the shifting canvas of the heavens. Let him become acquainted with the wonders of earth and sea. Let him watch the unfolding mysteries of the changing seasons, and in all his works learn of the Creator. So we see again, this is just going back to the principle of education and highlighting the fact that education has a very key rooting in the things of nature, as it is the place where we get to see the testimony of the Creator and what he has done with his works, rather than merely studying the works of man. Now, Proverbs 6, verses 6 to 8 gives us a principle. It states, go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer and gathereth her food in the harvest. And so we see the principle from nature here, that the ant is wise by preparing. And so this is a lesson for us to take, in that when we get into the business of growing our own food, that we practice wisdom, because we get into the habit of making provisions, of thinking about the season ahead, things of that nature, and thus practicing the wisdom that Scripture describes to us. Now, I wanted to highlight something here, which is very interesting to me. So when we think about the garden, there are many different things that happen in the garden. And I believe that many of the things that we do in the garden are actually mimicking or inspired by the way that nature actually works. So I've taken an example here of a very simple ecosystem. This is an example, you could say, based on, I'd say, a Eurasian ecosystem by the species that I've listed here. And what you'll find is that each animal in nature has a different purpose. And you'll find that these purposes highlight the principles that it is wise for us to be aware of when we garden. So in nature, in an ecosystem, we have browsing animals, such as the deer on the left. And what a browsing animal does is it goes about vegetation, such as bushes, trees, and it eats the vegetation on them. I don't know if anybody's ever noticed, especially anywhere where deer tend to frequent. I'm sure Trevor has seen this before, where the trees naturally, anything below 6 feet is bare, and you have like a single trunk going up. and then everything above it is foliated. And you'll find that in some places it almost looks like somebody has come with a mechanical device and just cut through that thing. Um, yeah, no, Trevor would have seen this because we've been on walks in our locale and seen where like the red deer browse, and it looks like somebody has taken some kind of strimmer device and just cut everything below 6 feet. So browsing animals, their job is they eat this vegetation that is growing on the trees and on the bushes. They're effectively pruning the bushes, in a sense. Now, then you also have rooting animals, and what the rooting animals do is they dig in the soil, they turn the soil, and an animal that gives an example of this is a wild boar. And interestingly enough, we actually do have these in the UK. They were brought back from extinction in the 80s by accident. And what you'll find is that for people who live in the west of England, like in the Forest of Dean, they will literally find entire tracts of land that just looks like they've been gone over with a plow, basically. And so what the wild boar do is they root around in the soil, they dig and dig and dig and dig, and they tend to consume foods such as acorn, and they defecate out the things that they eat into these areas that they have dug and wallowed in. Now, the other type of animal I've listed here is the grazing animals. So in this example, I've got a Przewalski's horse, which is the last true wild horse that we have in the world. And what grazing animals do is they tend to eat low vegetation, i.e. grass, and turn places into meadows. Because what they do is any trees that try to grow up out of the soil, they kill the trees. So whenever you have grazing animals that eat that very, very low vegetation, these areas become meadows or grassland. This is why if you notice in many parts of the UK, where they have sheep pasture, you see nothing grows there, because their job is effectively to kill larger vegetation. So that's the grazing animals. Then you have the seed-eating animals. And in this example, I've got a red squirrel and a jay, both which are native to the UK as well. And what they tend to do is they consume seeds and they scatter those seeds where they are located. They tend to bury them for safekeeping later. And then lastly, we have the predator. And in this case, this is a Eurasian wolf. Now, we don't have these in the UK anymore, but if you hop across the pond to maybe France, you will see these if you're lucky. Now, what does this have to do with gardening? So I'll just show you here. Whoops. Okay. So as you can see, the descriptions have changed underneath each of these animals. So the browsing animals, they are the pruners. So they do the job which we replicate in the garden where we prune. Because when we tend to prune bushes, what happens is that bushes tend to only fruit on 1-year-old wood. So therefore, if you leave your branches on your wood or on your bushes, and they are more than a year old, they gradually produce less fruit or tend to only produce on the tips. And so when we prune, we cut back wood in order that we have fresh growth continuing, so that every year we are having the production of stems that have fruit on them. And this is what the deer are doing in the environment. When they're browsing on those trees, they're browsing on those bushes. One of the reasons why we can find fruit in more abundance is because they are doing their job of stripping back that vegetation. And so they are the model for what we attempt to do in the garden. Now, the other example, the wild boar. The wild boar does what we do in tilling the soil. Because in the same way that the wild boar is digging the soil, is aerating the soil, and dropping the seeds from the foods that it's eaten or defecating into that soil, the boar is making a seed bed which is ready for us to start our process of growing food. And so we do the same thing. We're mimicking what they do by when we dig the soil out. So this is just another example. Now, the grazing animal, in this case, we have represents mowing. Now, many of us may be familiar with the fact that we we have lawns, we cut the grass down, we keep it neat, we keep the sections that we don't want to have certain types of plants controlled. And so we are taking our cues from grazing animals. And then for the seed eating animals, we are taking the cue of sowing. In the same way that they bury the seed into the soil, we do the same thing. Now, this is an interesting one. So the predator, in this case, is a wolf. This is land management, because in the ecosystem, the purpose of the wolf, in fact, is to dictate where all of the other species go. Because if you think about it, and I guess this is part of the reasons why the UK ecosystems aren't functioning very well, because if you have too many deer and they're staying in one area too long, what are they going to do? They're just going to eat back the vegetation on those trees beyond the point where it's helping to sustain 1-year-old growth. They just eat everything until the point whereby the growth is eaten right back. In the case of the tilling animal, like the wild boar, if it just stays in one area digging the soil up constantly, then nothing really gets a chance because it will constantly be rotivated. The same thing with the grazing animal. If all you have is grazing animals staying in one spot and never moving, then the trees will never grow back because the grazing animals eat them from the minute that the shoots come up. And similar thing with the sowing animals. And so what the predator does is its presence dictates how long the other members of the ecosystem are to remain in place. So if the deer are in an area operating and they know there's a wolf there, they're not going to stay there too long. The same with the wild boar, the same with the grazing animals. So what that does is it allows the land to rest. It allows the vegetation to get a chance rather than being constantly hammered by all of these herbivores. And so the predators are very important. And so the cue we take from that is how we manage our land when we do our garden. So the fact that maybe some sections we may not grow the same thing they're on there that year, or some sections may be lying fallow, things of that nature. So we're taking our cues of the predator in terms of what we do and when, as opposed to having everything happening all the time, all year round, etc. Now, another thing I wanted to highlight concerning the garden was, given most of us, or many of us who might be watching are based in the UK, that there are factors to consider concerning climatic zones. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is because it highlights disadvantages and also advantages that one should be aware of depending on where they are, so that one can plan properly and also be prepared for worst case scenarios. So I've divided it up into a few different sections. So I've got the south and the east of England. And the characteristic highlighted here is to do with warm summers being the common feature, the land being low, fertile, and flat. The fact that in these conditions, the soil, the light, the water, nutrients, air, climate, they affect how well crops grow. And so when you have climates like this, which is common in this part of the map, arable farming tends to be what is mostly practiced. So for example, if anybody's driven through these regions, what you'll find is you'll find a lot of crops such as wheat, barley, oats, rye, corn. Those are the kind of things that I can say that I've seen grown in my locale. And you tend to see a little bit less of livestock, because what's happening in this part of the country is that the best summers and also the most fertile land is present, to the extent where I believe in Kent. Kent is the Garden of England, and most of our food tends to come from Kent because it gets the most sunlight of the than any other region in the UK, even to the extent where growing olives on a commercial scale is possible in Kent. And East Anglia, which is also part of the eastern region as well, is known as the breadbasket of Britain because, again, there's low fertile land, warm, long summers, things of that nature. So you tend to find these conditions are optimum for growing wheat. So the characteristics are longer growing season, more total days of warmer temperatures, good sunlight, and fertile land. So with this in mind, this depending on if you're located in this part of the country, it's good to be aware of that because what you'll find is that the type of farming that you see happening in different parts of the UK gives you clues as to what challenges you may encounter depending on what you're trying to accomplish with agriculture. So when you see areas that tend to be mostly, and I'm talking about entire regions, which tend to mostly be arable, you know, the land tends to be is more fertile, the seasons are longer, there's better sunlight, things of that nature. Now, the other example is we've got the southwest of England. Now, the west of England and the southwest are also warm, but they're a bit wetter. The land is tends to be hilly or flat, but it's usually not steep. And what you'll find is that you tend to get more livestock here, but in particular dairy livestock, because of the fact that in this warm conditions you also have wetness, and so the characteristics of this part of the country, as far as growing food is concerned, is you have warmer temperatures, good sunlight, but you get significantly more rain, and so therefore, whilst the farming can be good, the farmers tend to not do arable farming as much because the wet conditions affect yields. And so if you're driving through that part of the region, what you'll find is you probably will notice a lot more cows and things like that and not as many crops, which is again a clue as to what kind of conditions one may need to prepare for or mitigate against when trying to grow food if you're located in that part of the country. Now, Central England has got fertile soils as well. The land is flat. The climate is warmer than the northern areas. It's slightly wet, but it is cooler. And so as a result of this, Central England tends to use mixed agriculture. So you tend to have a mix of arable farming as well as livestock. So it will be a region where it wouldn't be dominated by arable conditions because it's maybe not as good as further south, but it's still not as bad as further north. So the compensationary farming is that you will see a good mix of livestock, and also you will see you also see arable as well. And so what that tends to show you is again that the type of farming is indicating the conditions. And in this case, the idea that it's relatively warm, but not as wet as, say, the west or the southwest. The fact that the land is fertile as well. And so one has to just take these things into consideration with the knowledge of that area. Now, other areas, can't go into all of them, but generally follow a similar vein. So the quality of farmland and the geography of any given area impact agriculture. And interestingly enough, when I was looking into statistics on this, it said that 80% of farmland in Wales and 84% of land in Scotland is regarded as LFA, which is less favorable areas. And low yield areas mainly comprise of hill farms and upland moors. And hence, when you go to these regions, what you'll find, anyone who's been to Wales, sheep everywhere. And this is partly because it's not profitable to do other types of farming. Because what happens with sheep is that in areas where the land is less fertile, where it rains a lot, farmers find that the best way for them to qualify for their agricultural subsidy is to add sheep to the hills so that they can qualify enough to make some money. And so when you go in these regions and you're mostly just seeing sheep, it tells you that the land is less fertile, that the climate is wetter, and sheep are kind of like the lowest common denominator as far as what farmers can get away with. And to be honest, sheep aren't even profitable, to be fair, but they will at least qualify the farmers for subsidies. So in these regions, they tend to be more dominated by this type of activity, which tells you about some of the unique challenges that you may face if you are in these parts. And so whilst that might seem a negative, one thing to bear in mind is that there are some exceptions within these regions. So central Scotland, for example, is better for mixed farming as it has a slightly wetter and warmer climate than other parts of Scotland. Wales, as the slide highlights, is more mountainous and has a wetter climate than much of the UK, again, which is why it's classed as LFA. But so with these features in mind, this is why it's more suited for pasture and livestock farming and not really arable cropping. But what one has to be mindful of is that if I'm seeing that these regions are mostly um, sustained on this type of farming, then I know that maybe the land is not as fertile, the temperatures may be lower, it may be wetter. I probably have a shorter season to work with. And so therefore, one can plan rather than avoid disappointment by choosing the crops that one grows intelligently, maybe investing in some polytunnels if you are into that, having some greenhouses so that you can get a slightly longer season. And so it's just very important to just understand that if these certain conditions are demonstrated, in these regions, it's better to be aware of it so that one can plan, because mitigation is the best way to ensure yielding good results, rather than being disappointed and not understanding why certain things may not be working as well. So these are just things to just be mindful of, just to give the forewarning of the need to mitigate or adapt to what the conditions are in your local area. So with these other areas that's highlighted here, so yes, very wet, but with Wales, it's milder than other areas. So you can do well in certain places, but again, you need those mitigations, such as maybe, the greenhouses, the polytunnels, and also just being aware that the wetness may be a challenge, because rain is a good thing, but too much rain is not a good thing. Because what rain tends to do is it tends to spread diseases to plants. I'm sure Trevor will be familiar with just the issue of blight if you're growing tomatoes, and the fact that a heavy downpour at certain times of the year can wipe out entire crops. Because a lot of plants, they do not like to be rained upon constantly. And so therefore one has to just be mindful of that if that's a feature of the area. And then, as I said again, with Scotland and the North, shorter season. So therefore, one may have to think about, okay, if my crop is going to take 200 days, do I have 200 days of sunlight in the season in this part of the country? Maybe not. So maybe let me get a greenhouse, maybe get something in there, or maybe instead I'll grow something else. And these are just some of the references that just highlight where I receive the information on these things. Okay, so as far as another thing to be mindful of as far as gardening and the principles to be aware of, frost. In different parts of the country, the frost is a very big factor, because frost tends to affect when you can put your plants out. Because if you put young seedlings out whilst we are still getting frost in the mornings, they can die. And so you can actually find frost calendars online. The one that I have here is from Garden Focused, and it allows you to be able to key in your local area to adjust the dates on the site, and it will give you the dates of when the last frost is. Now, the last frost can vary widely. So, for example, I know that in some parts of the UK, especially as further north you go, I think in some parts of Scotland, the last frost could be as late as June. And so, therefore, what that can mean is that when you can put your certain plants out safely, may be influenced significantly by that. While some parts people may be able to get things out maybe early May, you may have to be mindful that you may have to wait till late June, and therefore you may have a shorter season. So to avoid disappointment, just be mindful of when the frost for your local area. A perfect correlation, but there is variation to just be aware of, so that you get the best results. Now, planning your garden. Think about the following questions. What grows in your area? So sometimes what you see in your area may indicate examples of things that can do grow well. So, for example, as I mentioned, some if you're maybe in some parts of the country, like you may be seeing corn growing in your area, and so therefore for example, for a fact that okay, that's something that is definitely going to grow well, so I can give that a try. Um, you also need to think about what do you enjoy eating, because I think that when you find the things that you enjoy eating, you may be more motivated to proceed with the gardening, and you find you get more utility out of your garden if you're growing the things that you know you need a lot of, or the things that you tend to consume a lot of. The other thing to consider is start with easy crops. And the reason why it's beneficial to start with easy crops is because, from a psychological standpoint, um, you can achieve small wins by seeing success early on. And so, certain types of plants are much easier to grow than others. So, for example, I would say potatoes are quite easy to grow. And you might find that that is a good start for you. Or, for example, spinach. Spinach is very easy to grow, to the extent that when spinach becomes established, it almost becomes like a weed. So the point is that you will find yourself feeling much more motivated if you start with something that you can manage and experience success, and then you can add more and more as you progress. Another thing is to consider is draw your garden. So you could draw out a sketch to show the space that you have to work with. I know this is easier with an allotment, um, and you can design to say where things are going to go. And if you're somebody who seeks to move things around and grow things in different locations, then drawing your garden has the added benefit whereby each year you can plan by updating your sketch by saying that certain things that I had here are going to move over here. And so it can be very useful to just have that visual map to say where things are going to go. Now, tools and equipment. Now, there's many tools and equipment that one would need. The key things tend to be obviously digging tools, such as obviously your spades. I would also say, your rake. A fork is a very important one for loosening the soil. Pruning shears can be good as well, depending on if you have any trees. Wellington boots, gloves, watering cans, things of that nature are useful things to start off with. And then what I find is that as you progress with your gardening, you'll find that you'll discover a need for new and more advanced equipment. And so therefore you can add to your equipment list as the need presents itself. So I'll give you examples. So I think there was a time where I, for example, just use a trowel to just plant certain types of things like I don't know, let's just say it was garlic bulbs or onions. But then as time went on, I found that I benefited from getting one of these bulb planters, which allows you to kind of dip the construction into the soil, and then you can kind of pull out the soil, and then the soil stays inside of the planter. And then as you add in your bulb, you then just press a little button and then it releases the soil over it. So, for example, that was something that I found useful. But these things only really begin to manifest themselves as you get into the garden itself and find that you have limitations with the tools that you have. But I would just say, as a start, make sure you have good watering can, boots, gloves, um, a trowel to dig with, spades, fork, things of that nature. So planting and maintaining the garden. So as I mentioned, tools are very important, but then there are also other things that one has to keep in the back of their mind. So preparing the soil. So with the soil preparation, this can at times make or break success, because depending on how the soil has been prepared, such as digging the soil appropriately and also dressing the soil with nutrients, it can affect how we actually are experiencing the success or failure of the garden. So I'll give you an example. When we are growing different types of foods, there are certain nutrition or certain nutrients for the soil that affects the type of food that you're growing. So, for example, the main categories are NPK, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So NPK. And so nitrogen tends to promote leafy growth on vegetables. And so, for example, if I'm going to grow some spinach, the thing I'm going to consume is the leaves. So therefore, I want to amend my soil so that I have more nitrogen in the soil. And there are sources of nitrogen that can be found. So, for example, one that I tend to use is alfalfa. But then there are also other sources as well, such as cottonseed, things of that nature that can be added to the soil. Now, if it was a case that I'm growing more things for fruit production, let's just say I'm growing berries, or if I'm even growing pumpkins. Now, because that's fruit, what they tend to prefer is more phosphorus. And so therefore, what I'd want to do is to amend the soil in a way so that I'm adding more phosphorus to the soil. And an example of this that I use is there's something called rock dust. And rock dust is the mineral extraction that comes from volcanoes. And you can actually buy this in bags and you can spread this over the soil. And so if I know my bed is going to have foods that is fruiting, I will want this type of amendment in the soil. But then there are also other examples. For example, tomato feed can be also high in phosphorus. And so therefore, this is why these things tend to get sold in the stores. You can get them in organic form as well. And they can be quite good in general with fruiting plants, such as fruits and also vegetables that are the fruiting body of the actual plant. And then in the case of the potassium promotes root growth. So naturally, what kind of foods tend to be roots? We think of potatoes, we think of, for example, carrots. The things whereby the root structure is what we are going to harvest to consume, then we would want some more potassium. And I believe rock dust as well tends to be a good source of this. In fact, rock dust tends to have a good suite of nutrients minus the nitrogen. So soil preparation is very important to be mindful of in our gardening because it can mean the difference between larger or smaller yields. Now, seedlings or seeds, it's very important to know the different needs of different types of seeds and how we germinate them. So, for example, beans tend to do well with soaking, and then they can be added to they can be added to indoor pots in some potting soil. But the thing about beans is that they can rot very easily if there is way too much moisture for a prolonged period of time. Whereas other types of seeds may not be as sensitive. And so one has to just be mindful that how we start seeds would differ depending on the plant. And also even just caring for the seedlings as well. For example, many seedlings tend to, when they grow up, they tend to be quite green, very soft. And so at times when we plant them straight outside, they can be very soft and very vulnerable to destruction. And so it's beneficial to, when those seedlings are growing, to put them outside for parts of the day so that they harden off. And you'll find that they tend to change in their structure and get a bit coarser and tougher. And so you'll get your seedlings to be more robust by the time they go outside by giving them that type of care, that little bit of exposure to the outdoors. Watering is also important. Now, different types of plants require more water, different types of plants require less water. So, for example, pumpkins, they would require a lot of water. And so you could find that not watering those enough could be a problem as far as getting a good yield on your pumpkins and also good size. whereas other plants, you tend to not want to be watered as much. Um, and especially if you're doing certain types of plants indoors, too much water on certain plants can result in things like root rots, which can kill the actual plant. So it's just useful to be aware of the different plants' watering needs. There is no one size fits all as far as the watering, so it's very important to be aware. Another example I can give is onions. Onions are very thirsty plants. So when the summer comes, you really, if you want those onions to be of good size, need to water them thoroughly every day if possible, even multiple times a day if you really want to mitigate against high temperatures that happen in the summer. And it's important to check daily. One of the problems sometimes we have with gardening is that we tend to, I think, because we are a bit disconnected from the realities of growing food a lot of times, what can happen to us is that we allow our modern 21st century way of living to dictate how much time we have for these things. But we have to prioritize this and see it as something important. Because the reality is that city living is very artificial. We rely on food being brought in via trucks. The supermarkets only have so much food for a certain amount of time. We saw it during lockdown how quickly things can run out. And so therefore, if we want to be wise and get closer to how God designed us, which is to have an awareness of where our food comes from and an awareness of producing it, then we have to see the garden as something important. And that will mean carving out time and making time in order to actually check our plants, in order to check the conditions, not only just as far as watering is concerned, but there's also just other things that can happen during the time that you're gardening. So this kind of goes on to things like weed control and pests. So the checking daily can help because weeds can emerge very quickly and they will compete with your plants for light, they'll compete for nutrients, and they'll compete for space. And in, for example, June, where I'm based, that tends to be a time where the temperatures climb, but you also get the potential of very heavy downpours whilst the temperature has climbed. And sometimes then your soil has been worked and that rain comes down whilst the heat has been around, and maybe you get that week of rain, and then you come back and it looks like all of the soil that you have dug out, you didn't do anything because those weeds have come up. Now, if you are checking regularly, then you will be able to intercept that intense weed growth that's seeking to frustrate your work. Another thing is also keeping an eye out based on what was doing. So, for example, at my allotment plot, we have a lot of activity of foxes. And the thing about foxes is that people tend to think of foxes as just carnivorous animals, but they are actually omnivores. So one, they are not, should I say, too aloof to eat vegetative foods, and also they tend to like to interfere with the soil. So I'll give you an example. They will, for example, go for my soil amendments. So let's just say I've added a nitrogen source to my soil for my potatoes, like alfalfa. The foxes will dig up the bed to get to the alfalfa. And if you aren't checking on a regular basis, you may find that your potatoes are strewn onto the soil rather than in the soil. Or the same thing with onions. They tend to have a thing about onions. Also, even adding things to the soil that you don't want there. For example, there was one year our allotment plots where I was finding dead birds buried in the soil. I was finding eggs buried in the soil. I found nappies buried in the soil because the foxes can smell the calcium. So hence they go for nappies, and you may find that in your allotment plot. Not a very nice surprise. But also there was one year we were finding rabbits. Loads of people reported finding these dead rabbits, either half buried or lying on top of their garden. And that can attract attention maybe of other animals that you don't really want. So it pays to just keep an eye on what's going on in your plot because animals can be at large. I think one of our allotment neighbors as well one year mentioned that somebody hadn't closed the gate, so a deer got in once and was living in the allotment for a while before it eventually found its way out. So again, just be aware of what's going on in your plan. Try not to allow the rigors of 21st century living to sideline the garden as a priority. Now, the harvest is something to be mindful of. So be ready for the harvest. And I say this because the harvest may produce its bounties at different points in the season. And if you're not aware of it, then you may miss certain things. So, for example, we have the example of garlic. Garlic tends to come up late June, early July. Now, if you aren't checking your plot or you haven't made time to actually harvest that garlic, then what you'll find is that you may miss the boat. And sometimes if the garlic stays in the soil too long, it will start to resprout as new individual plants rather than as rather than you getting the bulbs and being able to take them and dry them so that you can have them for the table. So aware of when things are ready to harvest and make sure that you've carved out a time, a plan to say when you are harvesting certain things so that you don't miss things. Another example is in the case of berries, strawberries tend to be more produced around, from what I remember, June into July. So again, if you are keeping an eye on your garden, then rather than miss that cropping and have all the animals eat the strawberries, then you'll be prepared to harvest your strawberries at the right time. However, if I was to take the example of raspberries, raspberries tend to grow up from the June right through down to through to October. So you have a very long span of time in which you can gain the benefit of harvesting those raspberries. So again, be mindful of that because you'll find that you have to regularly make trips in order to take advantage throughout that whole season of that fruit rather than having that fruit go to waste. However, if I was to give another example of another berry, in the case of the blackberries, they aren't produced during such a long span of the season. It tends to be more from late July through into August, maybe into a bit of September. And so it's kind of like this one period that you have to be ready to harvest those blackberries. So and then also there's a type of berry that I also grow, which is called tayberry, which is a cross between a raspberry and a blackberry. And it's probably my favorite out of all of them. But the thing is, unlike the raspberry, it doesn't grow throughout the season in terms of producing its fruits. But at the same time, it doesn't make one big crop, say in late summer. It tends to do one big crop in early summer. So being aware of just when these things are coming out just allows you to plan better so that you avoid wastage. Um, Another thing to be mindful of with the harvest is allow some of your food to bolt. And what bolting is from a gardening standpoint is when you allow some of your plants to grow to the completeness of their life cycle. So let's just say you're talking about lettuce. We tend to harvest the lettuce when the leaves are nice and fresh and the plant is reached a good shape. Whereas if you allow the lettuce to go to its full life cycle, it tends to elongate and grow taller and taller and have thinner and thinner leaves. And at that point, the leaves are bitter, so you don't want to eat them. But what it will then do is start flowering because the plants flower as they get nearer to the end of their life cycle or the end of their productivity for that season. And so if you allow some of your plants to do that, then you can save the seeds and you can keep those seeds and sow them so that you're not dependent on having to always be growing and buying seeds from a retailer. So for example, in the case of courgettes, that would mean leaving one of your courgettes maybe to grow into like a giant marrow-sized fruit. And what you'll find is when they get to that kind of large marrow size where they're at their maximum growth, although the fruits may be a bit tougher, what you'll find is you'll get some nice viable seeds. Whereas when you're picking them for harvest, you'll be harvesting the courgettes smaller, and you'll find that there will either be no seeds, or the seeds are like these kind of fleshy, flaky, melt in your mouth type of seeds that are obviously not viable because the fruit hasn't been left long enough. Um, so just allow some of your food to bolt, because then you can save some seed. And then the last thing is food preservation with the harvest. It's useful to be aware of how to store your food. Um, Now, I can't speak to canning because I'm not an expert on canning, but I can speak to just simple preservation. And that comes down to just understanding the different properties of different types of food. So, for example, if you have a garage, the conditions in a garage are optimum for storing potatoes. They'll keep the potatoes nice and cool, and you'll be able to keep them throughout the winter, and you can retrieve them from the garage as and when you need. And it's only when the temperatures start to warm up in the spring where they start to chit and get little stems on them. So you know that the garage is a good place for your potatoes. Same thing with your onions. However, if you put a pumpkin in the garage, that will start to rot because the conditions are not optimum. In fact, I made that mistake one year. We put one of the pumpkins in the garage. Now, in the case of the pumpkin, keep it indoors. You just put it in your house, and the warmth in the house will keep it preserved for months and months. And another example, and this is slightly ambitious. So one of the things that we got into our plot was we started growing our own wheat, because we have a mill and we make our own bread. And so, although we buy our grains from organic farmers, for fun, we just grow a little bit of wheat and just top up our stores. And so the way to store wheat is that you can literally keep those in drums in the garage, and they can store infinitely. But what I found, however, was that because of the conditions obviously outside, you can't get away from the fact that little mites and also little beetles and things like that will lay their eggs on your wheat plant in the during the season. And so obviously you may find that that might be in your grain. And what I learned the hard way was that you can just add a little diatomaceous earth into your grain. And in this case, it was food grade diatomaceous earth. Because, and the reason is because diatomaceous earth in food grade form, people take it as a supplement anyway. People just take it internally because it's supposed to be detoxifying. So if you buy food grade diatomaceous earth, if you're storing a grain like wheat, like the actual wheat berries, in a drum that you've grown yourself, for example, even if the diatomaceous earth is mixed in with your grain and you take it indoors and use it in the mill, that's fine because people eat the diatomaceous earth anyway. So since it's food grade, it doesn't matter that it gets into your food. It's just an additional cleanser anyway. So it won't matter if it gets into your flour. So that's why I use that. That's just an example. I'm not saying that's realistic that most people will try to grow wheat. In fact, I think that's a bit outside of most people's remit. But that's just an example of just being aware of how we preserve food in different ways. Now, I'm going to just play this video as this just highlights an example of the type of, or should I say an example of what our allotment plot looks like. So I'll just play it now. Okay. So the reason why I showed this was just as a bit of inspiration, because I think a lot of times for many of us who are viewing this content on this channel, the Journey Planner, um, or when we hear about country living or transitioning into country living, we tend to get fixated on this idea of having lots and lots of land. Um, Now, that may be something that some people can manage, but the reality is that from what I remember, the Spirit of Prophecy, she mentions a small piece of land, so that you can have a garden. Um, and so the point is that many of us, you'd be surprised at what you can do without having acres and acres of land. And also, many of us, we have to be realistic in that many people have never gardened before, never grown food before, even if they have the strong desire, um, that even after getting land, you probably may be just growing on an allotment size scale, really, from a time standpoint. Because to grow much more than that, that land would have to be providing your income. And so then the question is, do you have the time to work that amount of land to a point where it's profitable? And so from the standpoint of just feeding our families, in line with just the kind of object lesson things of that nature, sometimes we just have to be aware that actually allotment size is probably the scale that most people will probably be aspiring to in terms of what they realistically can manage, still having to provide for their families financially in other ways. Um, and so I say that to highlight that getting into this type of thing is achievable. It's not a situation where one has to feel as though they're going to be getting into a business of just an insane amount of land that they're going to need. You can do a lot on a small space. In fact, I remember watching one gardening channel where there was a man in America who was living in a suburb of a particular city, and he turned his backyard into a market garden to the point where it was providing him tens of thousands of dollars a year. Um, and he was just very intelligent with how he works the land. So I know that in some countries, people can buy a house and, I don't know, get 40 acres. Most people are not going to farm 40 acres. Most people are not going to have the time nor the expertise. So no one needs to feel disheartened about not having a lot of land. You'd be surprised at what you can do even on an allotment plot. So, for example, traditional allotment plots were always understood to be about the size of a doubles tennis court. So that's like probably about 60 by 30 meters. We have two allotment plots at my site, would equate to about that. And as you saw from the video, you can see the amount of things we're able to do. In fact, that's enough of a time challenge on myself as it currently is, to be fair. I'm not really looking for much more than that at this stage. I would just maybe like to have that setup maybe in the vicinity of my home rather than having to travel to my allotment plot. Even though my allotment plot's about 5 minutes away, it's still. So the point is that a lot can be done. There is no need to be concerned with a lot of talk concerning loads and loads of land. It's not going to be necessary or achievable for most people. And so, but if you are somebody who can achieve that, that's great, wonderful. But no need for the rest of us to feel disheartened because we can do a lot with a small amount of space. So next steps, start at home. You can start at home simply by pots on your windowsill, or you can start by sowing and planting directly into your garden. Or if your garden, like our first house had just a concrete area which was very small, we had to use pots as I showed in the pictures at the beginning. It doesn't matter what your setup is, just make an effort to start. You will learn a lot, and I believe that as you start, it's just like the parable of talents, whereby God will give you more according to your need. And in our case, that's what it was. We faithfully used our pots extent where we reached the limit of what we could do in that space. So then God allowed that the kindness of one of our church members' hearts impressed them to offer us a small piece of the allotment plot. And as good as that was, I think our ambitions were still such that we could do more. And so rather than waiting years, we were fortunate that we waited, I think it was a matter of weeks to get the plot that I showed to you at the beginning. And so the point is that just like the talents, it's just about making the use of what you have, and God will see your needs, especially if you ask, and provide you with more, but it will be proportionate and appropriate to your needs. So it's not a case of falling into the trap of thinking that until I move somewhere really remote, I'm not going to start growing anything, because only once I do that, that's when I'll have time. That's not the way to look at it. I would strongly encourage viewers to just make a start now how you can. Second thing one can do, if one is in an area where they have allotment sites, feel free to sign up for an allotment plot. You may be surprised, you might get one sooner than you think, and you can just make a start. But I strongly encourage decide purpose in your heart beforehand that you consider gardening important and not just a hobby because we have the ability to go to supermarkets. I think God wants to transition our mindsets out of that. Actually decide that it's important. And I think you have more success because I believe it changes your lifestyle. It changes your lifestyle in the sense that I find the years go by quicker because of the growing season. So for example, at the end of one growing season, I'm already thinking about the next growing season. And I'm thinking about what I'm doing at different stages of the year. And so I find that the years just roll on very, very quickly. Like if I was to just look back at the time since we had our plot. So we started our plot in 2017. So we're in our 8th season. I can't believe that the time has flown. So it just goes to show that it does change the way that you look at time. It changes the way that you look at what's important as well. And I think it kind of helps to transition out of the 21st century mindset whereby we are just consumers rather than producers, where we are just about comforts. When we actually garden, then we think more in line with, I guess, how our ancestors in the past used to live, whereby they were very aware of their environment, very aware of how things worked, how aware of their food. It's almost a rehabilitation away from the kind of I guess the dulling that the convenience lifestyle has had. So I'd say if you are somebody who is ambitious enough, by all means, get an allotment, decide this is important, and make a start. Even if you don't use the whole plot, just make a start with what you can, and you'll be surprised at what you can accomplish. Now I'm going to just share a video, a short video, and this is about how to sign up for allotment.
Hi, I'm Dion.
And I'm Philip.
And you're watching We Sow. And on today's episode, we're going to talk to you about how to go about signing up for an allotment plot.
Yep. And the steps are quite simple. So typically every council has some provision for an allotment plot. So in some cases, if it's a big town or something, there may be a number of sites in the town. Or if it's a small village, it might be one site, or it might be in the next village. Or in a city, there might be many sites across. So you just go to the website, type in allotments. Sometimes they may have a separate site, but the council site will tell you if that's the case. Fill in the form, which is usually online, and you should hear maybe in about a week or so that your application has been accepted and you will be put on the waiting list.
Yeah, so when you fill out the initial form on the council's website, that tends to just be an expression of interest at that point. And what they tend to do is, once there's a plot available, they'll write to you and they'll send you an invoice so that you can pay for your allotment plot. Mm-hmm. So we pay about £40 a year for our allotment plot.
but it can vary. So it could be as little as £10 if the demand is not very high, and it could be as much as 100 if the demand is high. And on some popular sites, you might get less land, and in some less popular sites, you might get a lot of land for very little.
Yeah. And if you are quite new to gardening and you're not quite sure that you want to sign up to an allotment plot, maybe you could speak to, friends or an elderly person that might have a plot, and you might want to ask them if you can just use a little patch of theirs to start off with. That's certainly how we started.
Absolutely.
And that just gave us the encouragement that we needed to get our own. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.
Remember to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, so we've come to the end of the presentation. I've just got some resources on screen. These could be screenshotted or noted down, but they are Adventist Agricultural Association. Allotment Month by Month is a good book as well, which we personally own. There's Carrots Love Tomatoes by Louise Riot. And then, of course, there's our YouTube channel, We Saw, and as well as our Instagram and our Facebook. And then there's also this website from nsalg.org.uk, which has month by month growing advice. So when you log into the site, you can get advice that pertains to the month that is relevant. And so I'd just like to leave it now to if there's any questions.
Philip, that was very informative. Thank you very much for your time and the effort that you've put into putting the presentation together for us. So as Philip alluded to, we've got some time for question and answers. You should be able to put, if you're in the Zoom meeting, you should be able to put your questions in the comments box or the chat box. And if you're not on Zoom, I believe we may be able to pick up questions if you're on YouTube. If you're watching live on YouTube, you should be able to put questions in there as well. So Phil, I'd just like to ask you about
Sure.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask you about the climatic zones that you highlighted earlier on in the presentation. What impact is that something that you were aware of before you moved to Stevenage, or is this something that you've come to be aware of, and hence you would prefer to stay in the southeast of England rather than moving to the north or to the west or to the southwest?
I wasn't aware of it. I was completely unaware. At the time when I moved, it was because my wife and I were genuinely looking for somewhere that was accessible to at the time where my family was, which was London, but they've since moved up to Bedfordshire now. So at the time it was proximity to them, but also accessibility of transport to my wife's family in the Midlands. So that was why we settled on Stevenage. And then at the time, it was also work as well was a factor. However, because I'm interested in ecosystems and also nature and things of the like, I became aware of these things through content I was watching online and things that I was investigating. So, for example, I was following movements such as I think it was rewilding, and I started to learn about things such as the Common Agricultural Policy. I started to learn about the type of farming that was happening in different parts of the country, and how it was impacting our ecosystems. So because I was aware of that, then it started to paint a picture of investigation into, okay, what type of farming is going on in different parts of the country, and also why I started to pick up on the differences in the countryside as I traveled through different places. Like I would physically notice different types of things in the fields in some parts of the country, more so than in the fields in other parts of the country. And I wanted to know why. I also found as well that when I was looking into gardening, um, I'm quite ambitious in terms of experimenting or exploring what I can grow in the UK, because we typically tend to think that there's certain things we won't be able to grow because the UK just doesn't have great weather. For example, I found where I live, I can grow sweet potatoes outdoors. And so I wanted to see, okay, will where you are located influence or affect the list of things that I grow? Because, for example, I also started to grow figs, um, and found that even though the conditions are good for figs, there can still be challenges that can cause you to lose your crop. And I thought to myself, okay, here's all the things I love trying to grow. Now, will I have to reduce my list of what I can grow depending on where I'm in the UK? I wanted to kind of be aware of that. So then I started to combine the things that I was observing from looking at ecology, and started to look at agricultural sites. The government have these things, and I was fascinated at the picture I was seeing, and the fact that many of us aren't aware of this, because I think sometimes we feel like the most remote areas in the UK are the best for growing foods or things like that, because we think these places are more country. But the reality is that some of these places are the way they are because the conditions aren't optimal if you were to like go back in history for producing food sufficient to support a population. And so therefore the land will be cheaper because it's not optimum land for certain types of activity. One thing I found was that 70% of all agricultural jobs are actually in England. Um, More so that just kind of tells you really the picture. So certain areas are more empty because they aren't as optimum for producing foods, and so therefore historically they couldn't support population sizes and things of that nature. And so it became fascinating because I think even there was one incident somebody spoke to me about where our church had a site in a particular part of the country and wanted to change the use of the land because of certain issues they were having, and wanted to consider growing foods. But again, they were in a low LFA area and found that the land was completely unsuitable for growing crops, especially because there was so much rain that the field just kept getting flooded out as well. And so I think it's useful to be aware of these things. I think many of us aren't really aware. We kind of assume that, if it's green and peaceful, then it will be great for growing foods, and then find ourselves disappointed. So I just wanted to see whether what I was seeing had any mileage. So I did my research.
Yeah, I mean that's a very interesting point, information that you shared on the climatic zones of the UK, because I think when we consider where we're going to go in the country from the city, like you said, it's good to have a awareness or foreknowledge of the land that you're going into. Like,
Mhm,
why isn't there established agriculture there,
mhm,
or arable lands there, or what are deemed as arable lands there? And what will be
mhm,
the challenges? What would you need to have in place so that you can have success in
mhm,
growing? Because the point that you made about starting with the easy crops and the psychology that would have on the success is also very important as well. Rather than go off with the things that you're going to find challenging and that constrain your time, then it's good to start with the things that are going to be easy and it's going to buoy your spirits up, so there's less disappointment and you can go from strength to strength. Like you said with your example about how when you first come to Stevenage, small place, just doing stuff in the pot, and then as you mastered that, outgrew it, God provided a bigger place for you to be able to continue the development. So maybe I don't know, maybe in 5 years you'll be telling me that you have 400 acres and producing on a industrial scale. But
Mm,
we'll see. So that's, I mean, like I said, the climatic zones are very interesting what you mentioned there. Now, if you were to move again, how much of a role
mm,
would those climatic zones play in your move? Or would it just be a case of, well, I'm considering this part of the country, I just need to know that I'm going to prepare in order to grow
mm,
effectively, I'm just going to prepare uh, polytunnels or polytunnels
mm.
or something like that. Or otherwise, what sort of impact do you think it would have on your next move if you were to move?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I, to be honest, I'm not suggesting that other people should think this way, but I do think it does influence my preferences to an extent. Um, and one of the reasons is because also I do gardening for the love of gardening, and I don't want to be rated um, by certain things. So, for example, I remember I saw a documentary where this family had relocated from, I think it was Surrey, and they moved to an island right off of the top of Scotland. And they had started to live in a caravan and were, raising their produce, growing, farming chickens and all kinds of stuff. And somebody who came to document them, he asked them about the feeding of the chickens, and they were saying the truth is we don't even break even with the chickens because we have to import the feed from the land from the mainland, and the chickens were all skinny because it was so cold and wet that they were shivering constantly. Um, and so for me, I would struggle to, for example, make that kind of move, knowing that I will have so much difficulty growing foods. Especially one of the things that bothers me a lot is rain. A lot of rain I find frustrating because I've seen the impacts of the amount of disease it gives plants.
Mhm.
Um, so I think it would impact my preferences. I'm just being completely honest. But to what extent I can't be certain at this stage.
Mhm. Thank you, thank you. Now, you mentioned that you grew wheat.
Mm,
How much wheat did your and that your plot the plot that you're on is about 60 meters by 30,
mhm.
the combined total area land space that you have. And the area
Yes.
that you're growing the wheat on, how much space is that?
So the years that I have done it, I've used what would be a quarter of that 60 by 30. And the year where I got the most, I think I got about 7 kilos of wheat off of it.
Wow. So
Um,
so that's not bad at all. For I'm not sure how what percentage the 60 by 30 is in terms of
yeah,
a fraction of an acre, how much of a percentage of an acre
yeah,
that is, but 7 kilos of wheat from a quarter of that
yeah,
is is not bad at all, I don't think. And probably
yeah.
because you were still learning, experimenting,
Mhm.
maybe if with more experience that yield would be greater, right?
It's possible, yeah, because one can, for example, do things like influence how how wide the rows are between your wheat. Um, However, for me, I do it mainly because I enjoy it and because I find that I learn a lot of lessons from it. So going through the process of sowing, harvesting, sowing, watching the plant grow, it educated me on wheat in particular because there's a lot of talk about wheat in health circles. Um, Having seen it grow myself, having handled it with my own hands, shows that a lot of things that people are saying there's actually misconceptions, um, and that some of these arguments are believable mostly because we are ignorant of how wheat actually grows and what actually takes place in the field. And so so going through that process, it showed me one things in the Bible where the Bible is describing wheat, for example, to describe Christ and to describe his ministry. I started to see by the way it grows why the Lord used those principles. But also, I found that from a health standpoint, that some of the arguments concerning the problems with our bread and things like that didn't stack up. And I was inspired to get into the wheat because we had a medical missionary came to Stevenage, our friend Brother Floyd Mayberry. He came over from the United States and he did a presentation on the gluten-free movement and the deception in that it can be compared to the controversy of the Bible over the Bible, where if we say that the Bible is the bread, Christ is the bread of life, that we can have a direct parallel with the controversies that's happening in the natural world, whereby in the same way that people are experiencing problems with physical bread, in a spiritual sense, the way that our word or the scriptures is being handled is doing a lot of damage to how people relate to Christianity and to God. And that the solution is for us to take the matters into our own hands. So we take the word of God into our own hands and we break it down and study it for ourselves rather than being dependent on people's interpretations for us. And so likewise in the natural, many of the problems that people are experiencing, that if wheat was actually consumed whereby it was freshly milled, you can mill it in your home. You can buy mills online. You can buy, because we've got a wooden mill that we have in our house. I know you have one as well, Trevor. And ours can do about 200 grams of flour per minute. So you can just buy the wheat berries, organic wheat berries from organic farmers, store it yourself, put it through the mill, your flour comes out in a few minutes. And what you'll find that a lot of the problems that people are experiencing with wheat, for a lot of people, I'm not saying every single person, but for a lot of people, they'll find that if they're getting the flour fresh with all its nutrition in it, without the additives, without being stored for 2 weeks, which is what happens to flour and bread that's in the shops. It's been stored for so long that there's no nutrition in it. Hence why they have to add certain things that cause problems. You'll find that many of these concerns tend to no longer be of a concern. And so for me, when I went into thinking, let me take some of this and grow it in the actual allotment. Let me get a threshing machine and thresh this myself. I started to understand the scriptures when God talks about the destruction of Babylon and how Babylon will be, and the kingdoms before it will be, or the kingdoms after it will be blown away like this chaff on the summer threshing floors. I finally understood. I understood practically what that meant, because when we were threshing our wheat, Dion was just like using the machine, and she was just like, "This is such a violent process," and it made us think about the sifting process, how intense the test of God's people, but also God's wrath on the wicked systems is, that only precious wheat will come out at the end of that threshing machine, as opposed to the chaff, which is just the little husk that encases the wheat. The wind will just take that away like it's nothing. Now, I understood from the scriptures what I was saying. Also, going through that process made me understand as well just how some of these things that are popularized on the internet about how the process of producing grain and wheat happens, and the way that's talked about to garner support for, I don't know, things like gluten-free. I started to see how these arguments don't stack up, because I'm seeing how this grows. I'm seeing how you harvest this thing, and so I can see where the problems are coming in. But the average person will read an article and not have any idea because they don't understand agriculture.
I see. Thank you. Thank you. That's very insightful. One other question is, you mentioned about the deers and pruning. How do you prune? What's the method for pruning? And is it the case for all, one size fits all, or different trees, different bushes, different ways and methods of pruning?
Okay, so I'll give you an example. Now, in the case of the blackberry is fruit on 1-year-old wood. So what that means is if you have a blackberry bush, if 1 year the bush grows and it makes branches, and you don't cut back the growth at the end of the season, when you come the following year, what you're going to have is you're going to have a branch that is, let's just say it's more than a year old. And Then as the bush grows more and more, you have more and more old branches on that bush. And so therefore you get less and less fruit because fewer of those branches are young branches. So what then has to happen is that you want to cut back the growth so that it means that there's always this kind of young growth which is coming up during the year. So in the case of the black, what I do is end of the season, when I've harvested all the fruit, I cut branches right back so that the bush remains small. So any growth that it's had during the year, where let's just say it was this size and it's grown to this size, I cut it right back. I don't allow this amount of growth that came in the season to remain. So when I keep it small, it means that every year the growth is always 1 year old growth or coming off of 1 year old wood. It's always coming off of wood that hasn't been on the bush for longer than that. So what it means is that when those branches come out, those new growths come out, they are the ones that have all the flowers over it. So the trick is try to cut back at the end of the season for a lot of your berries. Like, so for example, raspberries is similar, so that you're always having any new growth is coming off a 1 year old branch. Now it will differ. So for example, for tomatoes, pruning may be done for a different reason. So in the case of tomatoes, when you prune a tomato, you're trying to stimulate more flowers. And because tomatoes, we tend to grow them, as annuals, so just for one season, what you want to do is you just cut maybe, let's just say you have the end of a leaf, maybe you cut half of it off, and you might maybe even just cut off the odd leaf, and you just cut as much as you need, one to open out the branches of the tomato so that air comes through. And what that will do is that will keep the moisture down so that you don't suffer from blight. So you're pruning to control disease, but also when you're cutting it through the season, the tomato thinks it's being consumed. And because it thinks an animal is consuming it, it decides that it needs to reproduce as quickly as possible. So then it will push out more flowers. So with tomatoes, you prune not only to control the aeration, but you keep cutting back some leaves so that the plant will prioritize making new flowers, which means more tomatoes. And then if I was to give you another example, let's just say, maybe, I don't know, maybe if it was pumpkins, for example, it may be a case that, okay, you have a fruit on a particular pumpkin vine, and let's just say you have 3 or 4 fruits on that vine, and you'll find that maybe you want a bigger pumpkin. If you remove some of that fruit, that plant will put more energy into one of the better pumpkins. And what you may end up also wanting to do is cutting back some of that vine to the fruit so that it doesn't waste energy spreading further than it needs to, or spreading further than the area that you've designated for it. So pruning will have different purposes depending on the plant, but you can just do some research on the specific plant.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. That's very interesting because I never considered pruning the plants and the vines as I would expect to prune the bush or the tree. So that's very insightful. Last question I have is on your thoughts on permaculture and no-till digging, or the no-till methods of gardening, because you alluded to crazes or fads in the way in what you mentioned, in how you answered when you're talking about the wheat. So just wondering what your thoughts are on those things as well.
Okay, so permaculture. I don't see anything wrong with these methods. I think if individuals want to try them, they're free to. I think the one drawback that I see with the no dig method is, for many people it can be could be a bit cost intensive, because there may be a lot of inputs one has to spend in order to, for example, if they're buying cardboard, hay, all these different kind of inputs. and it may take a long time for them to get the results that they want. And so it may not be cost effective to try and in terms of setting up a no dig garden. And also some people may struggle with success. But what I would say of that is that if you personally find it works for you, by all means, you can do it. I would say that for me, one thing that I tend to use a lot as a mulch on my soil is I use mineralized straw. And so in some beds, because that straw is mineral treated, it can last a couple years. So in some beds, you will have areas, I will have areas which are no dig, in the sense that certain types of plants are perennials. And so I don't actually need to dig those out. But it's not as effective for me, given the amount of space I'm trying to work, to generate all the inputs of all the things that I may need to buy at scale, and in a way that's guaranteed to work. So I would say it's completely up to you if you want to do it. But I don't think it's necessary for most people, but some people, they can give it a try and it may prove successful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's useful. That's helpful. I got a quick question going back to the wheat situation.
Yes.
If we cannot eat hybridized, or if the wheat cannot be hybridized, why do they say that it is hybridized? I think that's what the question is.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I've got a video on my YouTube channel about this, which is over an hour long, about this issue of wheat. I'd strongly recommend watching that. But what I would say, as a quick answer or a quicker answer, is there's a lot of misconception about what hybridized wheat is. So a lot of people assume that prior to the 1960s, that everybody just ate spelts and these type of so-called ancient grains, and that suddenly people started to crossbreed these types of wheats, or some kinds of wheats, with other grasses, and we made this hybrid common wheat. That is not true. If you trace the evolution of wheat, which my video highlights, the only wheat that existed that was unhybridized was the wild einkorn, and that hybridized with another species of grass in ancient times in farmers' fields. And after the wild einkorn was domesticated and it hybridized, then the emmer wheat, which is the wheat in the Bible, came about. And then farmers noticed that some emmer wheat had larger grains, and so they decided to name that type of wheat Durham wheat. And then Khorasan wheat as well, which is what we call Kamut wheat, was also in that chain of the family. And then these types of wheats that had emerged after the first hybridization also hybridized with other grasses in the wild. And one branch of the family became spelt and the other branch became common wheat. So the fact is that all varieties of wheat that we consume, with the exception of the einkorn, are the product of hybridization from ancient times, even so much as Bible times. In fact, the common wheat that we have today, common wheat was around from the time of Christ and has been found in Roman tombs. Now, what they're talking about when they say hybrid wheat these days is where, because common wheat was a better form of wheat because of the fact that it threshes easily. In other words, it's removed from its husk very easily during the agricultural process. It became popular. So because it became popular, what people started to do with this type of wheat was it was taken to different parts of the world where it would have adapted to its different conditions. So, for example, there's Turkish red common wheat. There's also other types of common wheat in different parts of the world. And so what happened was in the 1960s, there were breeding experiments where they would have crossbred different types of common wheat. So in other words, the way I explained it in my video is it's like this. Imagine if I have horses who all have the same grandparents, and I send them around the globe, and then I'd crossbreed their children with each other. That's effectively what happened to common wheat. All that happened was that the same common wheat different varieties were crossbred. Just like if I have tomatoes and I send some tomatoes to a friend in America, and then 6 generations later, he sends me his plants and cross-pollinate. The fact is that they are all common wheats. They are all from the same ancestry. And so that is what hybrid wheat actually is that we have today. Um, and so what people are suggesting is that because a lot of people have begun to experience illness, that it's because that hybridization happened. When the reality is there's a lot of things that has happened to our food since then. And so the most important thing I would say is getting good quality organic wheat, regardless of what variety it is, and milling it yourself. Because it's at that point where the additives like the glyphosate, the fake nutrients that they add to it, the preservatives, because even if you buy spelt on the shelf, it's been stored for more than 2 weeks. So there's no nutrition in it anyway. And it would have preservatives and things to stop it from going rancid. Because the fact that flour doesn't go rancid in your home is because there is something in it. So the fact is really it's better to just look at it as get organic wheat. If you can get a millet, because a lot of these ideas that are being pushed is, I'd say, correlation rather than causation. And the idea that, everybody was eating ancient grain before the 60s is false. In fact, spelt didn't enter the United States until the 1890s. So all throughout America's history, they were eating common wheat. So common wheat is not something that just came about in the 1960s. They just decided to mix different races of common wheat with each other during that time of the Green Revolution. Now, I'm not saying I condone the Green Revolution, but I'm just highlighting the fact that some of the arguments are causing us to miss the main point, which is that human beings benefited from having access to freshly milled wheat. And that because we don't have that access, this is why our bread is not nutritious, which is why we miss out on the nutrients. Like there's like 40 of the 44 essential nutrients of the human body that's found in a grain of wheat. And we don't realize that wheat is that nutritious because we get it from the store. But if we actually ignored some of this fluff or some of these arguments and actually just looked into things such as milling your own wheat and getting fresh flour, then we would find that some of these problems that are trending may not affect as many of us. I'll give you one quick example. So we have a friend who was reacting to wheat and tried spelt from the store, and they were sick for days after consuming the spelt. Now we made them some bread using just normal common wheat, which we had got, from our suppliers. Made the breads, from milling it, etc. And she was able to consume that bread, and it did not make her sick. And so it just goes to show that sometimes we need to challenge some of these popular ideas.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. That's very insightful.
I hope that kind of explained what I was saying.
Yeah.
I know there was a question about diabetes, but
yeah,
again, that's a lot of science.
I think so. I've put a link in the description to your video, as well as I've posted it out on the various outlets that we have as well. So if anyone's interested in finding out what Philip had to say about that, I highly recommend you go across to his their YouTube channel, We Sow. And it's entitled Let's Talk About Wheat. So what I did was put in Let's Talk About Wheat, and then I put We Sow in, and it came up nice and easy. So if you want to see it, then I recommend you do that, and you can find out more about what Philip has researched and see for yourself somebody that's bucking the trend, as it were, and challenging those things. Because if you look into these things, you'll find that a lot of our food has been demineralized just because of industrialization of agriculture and cheaper ways of trying to boost the output without I guess, boost the output by cutting cost and just getting something that's big in size but empty in nutrition. And I think you kind of alluded to it when you were talking about the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the mix of these elements in the soil. And so, yeah, a lot of preparation needs to be considered when we're looking to grow our stuff. But I think the main thing that you brought across to us is we just need to start. And as we start, if we start looking for God to teach us his ways and we're willing to learn from God, God will just impress upon our hearts what tools we need to move on to that will save us time and help us to do the things more efficiently, what things we need to add to the soil, and how to grow and where to place things. So I think, like you said, it takes us away from the mindset that we have in this 21st century to really taking us back to having that connection with God and that this kind of thing. Because I'm sure when we automatically get paid into our bank account at the end of every month or during the month, and we automatically just go to the supermarket to buy what we need, God doesn't really feature in the picture so prominently as if we're dependent upon him to bless the soil, to bless the plant, to give us wisdom, to check the weeds and make sure we're in time to catch them when they're getting ready to pop. So thank you once again, Phil, for your time and what you've shared with us. I am sure that we have all been blessed by what we've heard, and those that missed the live presentation, I'm sure you will be blessed when you come to consider this at a later point in time. And I'm sure that the same principles about climatic zones and other things are consistent across the world, that various countries will have climatic zones in which various things will grow better in one part of the country than in another part of the country. And so wherever you are in the world, whatever country you're in, these are things to really consider when you're doing your gardening. What will grow best? And if what you want to grow isn't so easy to grow in your zone, then how can you make it so that you can grow that in your zone? So Phil, before we sign off for this evening, is there any closing remarks or words of encouragement that you'd like to give? Because there was something you picked up on. I picked up on when you when you were sharing it. It was also about the size of the land, that you don't necessarily need to, when you're looking to move out of the cities, you don't necessarily need to be looking for tens of acres or anything like that. You could move out quite comfortably and have something that you could do in a garden space that would tend to your needs. And so you doesn't necessarily need to be looking for, if you can't get to far out or somewhere very remote, then you could make that small step to us into something that it may not be ideal, but it's better than staying where you are. So I don't know if there's any other words of encouragement or motivation that you'd like to share with us before we sign off for the evening.
Yeah, sure. I think what I would just say really is just encourage everybody on here. Really, it's not to be concerned too much with everything that we hear. I think sometimes we can become a bit distracted by a lot of different ideas floating around, but I think God has different levels of duty for each of us, and different things that we can all manage. So I think it's just important to kind of keep our ear close to hearing what God is saying, close to the opportunities he's opening, and not being discouraged because of what maybe somebody else may have. It's just like, as I said, with the 10 talents, some may have 5, some may have 10. And it may well depend upon the opportunity that God may give. You know, God may require somebody to have a lot more because maybe they're going to do things on a scale that's going to benefit a large number of people. Some people, God ideal is that their home is like a mini outpost center, even though it may be just a family home, with enough space for them to have a garden that maybe could be their allotment, etc. So the point is that I'd say just encourage everyone to just be mostly concerned with what opportunities God is opening before you, and being able to faithfully make the best of those opportunities, and to not kind of talk ourselves out of the experiences we could have now, because sometimes if we're waiting for the ideal, it may never come. And the main purpose of all of this really is character development. And so it's just really important that we get the experience of that as soon as possible.
Thank you very much, Phil, for your time. Would you like to close us out with a word of prayer?
Of course, yes. Let's bow our heads. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity we've had to reason together, to discuss some lessons concerning your great lesson book of nature. Lord, we thank you for the fact that you have given us counsel about how it is we can be wise in the last days. Wise in terms of not only just economic security for a time, but also wise in terms of the lessons and the education that you want to give us, Lord, for our families, and as well as for all those who will be coming to our into our vicinity. And so, Father, I pray that you may bless everybody who's watching this stream, whether they are watching it live or whether they will see it at some point in the future. I pray that everybody will be encouraged to just make a start, to do one's best, to see what the prescription you've given us, Lord, as something important, and to not feel as though one must wait until they have what they've heard is the requirement for a form of country experience or a form of producing one's own food, but rather that they may be able to take in hand what you have put there, Lord, and to just utilize it for your glory to the best of their ability, Father. Lord, we pray that you may bless the continuation of these Journey Planner sessions. Lord, that as more guests come to encourage individuals, that great results may be yielded, Lord, that more people will be encouraged, more people will be inspired to benefit from your education plan. We thank you and ask that you may hear this prayer. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Phil, for your time once again. And just a reminder to everyone that we will be back again first Sunday in May, which will be the 5th of May. And we'll have another practical presentation on living in the country, or making that move to the country. Thank you again, and good evening, good night, and God bless.
Thank you again for watching the Journey Planner SDA. Remember to subscribe, like, and share the links to our YouTube and Facebook broadcasts. See you at the next episode.